I didn't call it paradise. That word always felt dishonest to me. What I told people, the few people I told, was that Mexico made sense, that it was practical, affordable, a place where my money would stretch far enough that I wouldn't have to think about it every day. That was the dream, if you can call it that, not thinking about money. I wasn't chasing beaches or women or some younger version of myself. I was tired. Tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Tired of measuring life in hours and deadlines and what my body could still tolerate. Back home, everything had become a countdown. How many years until retirement? How many more winters my knees could handle? How long before the numbers stopped working? Mexico felt like an answer to math, not emotion. I sold my house in Indiana the winter before I turned 60. It wasn't a bad house, just too big for one person and full of reminders of things that weren't coming back. The sale cleared slower than I expected, but when everything settled, after fees, taxes, savings I'd built quietly over decades, I had just under $200,000 set aside. Not rich, but enough. Enough if I was careful. Enough if I didn't do anything stupid. Enough to stop waking up at night doing calculations in my head. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after the closing, paperwork spread out, thinking this might be the first time in my adult life where I wasn't bracing for the next hit. I didn't announce my move. I didn't want opinions. I didn't want warnings. People hear Mexico and immediately supply a story you didn't ask for. I wanted a place where nothing dramatic was required of me. The city I chose wasn't famous. Inland. Ordinary. A place people passed through without stopping. Rent was cheap. Streets were busy but not loud. Life moved forward whether you watched it or not. That appealed to me. The apartment was modest, tile floors, white walls, a balcony that looked out over a street where vendors set up and packed down every day like clockwork. I paid 6 months up front and felt a physical release when the money left my account. Fixed costs are comforting when you're older. They make the future feel containable. I built a routine quickly. Morning coffee at the same cafe. A walk after. Errands in the afternoon. Dinner at home or at the same small restaurant where the owner eventually stopped handing me a menu. Routine didn't feel like boredom. It felt like safety. I wasn't lonely, at least not in the way people imagine. I spoke to neighbors. I exchanged pleasantries. I nodded to the same faces every day. That was enough. And then there was her. I didn't meet her in a dramatic way. No introduction, no moment worth pointing to. She worked nearby. We crossed paths often enough that conversation became inevitable. She wasn't flirtatious. She didn't perform interest. She talked the way people talk when they're tired and don't expect anything back. About work, about money, about how expensive everything was getting. She was younger than me, but that wasn't what stood out. What stood out was how normal she felt. No fantasy, no agenda I could see. We talked because it was easy. At first, she was just another part of the neighborhood, another familiar face that made the place feel lived in instead of temporary. I helped her once without thinking much about it. A ride when transportation fell through. Lunch one afternoon when she hadn't eaten. Small things that didn't register as decisions. She accepted help quietly. No show, no promises. That restraint felt like integrity to me. I liked that she didn't need much. Looking back, that's the sentence that should have slowed me down. I liked being useful again. That surprised me. I hadn't realized how invisible I'd felt back home until usefulness returned in small, manageable ways. Not as obligation, just as presence. The kind where someone noticed whether you showed up or not. I told myself I was still in control, that nothing depended on me, that I could stop anytime. And technically, that was true. At this stage, nothing had merged. My money was still mine, my plans were still my own, my days still belonged to me. I checked my accounts regularly. I tracked spending. I stayed well within what I planned. I felt responsible, measured. That sense of responsibility became part of my identity there. I wasn't one of the reckless ones. I wasn't chasing something unrealistic. I was doing it right. I heard stories from other foreigners occasionally. Men who lost money. Men who trusted too quickly. Men who ended up angry and bitter and loud about it. I didn't relate. Their stories had chaos. Mine had none. Everything in my life felt aligned, emotionally and financially. I slept well, I ate well, I walked every day. My body felt better than it had in years. I remember thinking one morning at the cafe that this must be what people mean when they say they figured things out. Not happiness exactly, but steadiness. I wasn't euphoric, I was relieved. That's the part that matters. Relief lowers your guard faster than hope. Hope makes you cautious. Relief makes you stop checking. When she started becoming part of my daily rhythm, not my life, just my rhythm, it didn't feel like attachment. It felt like continuity, someone to talk to, someone whose problems I understood just enough to feel helpful, not burdened. Nothing felt risky because nothing felt urgent. I still believed I was operating inside a wide margin, that even if something went wrong, I'd see it coming, that numbers don't lie. What I didn't understand yet was that numbers only protect you if you control the structure they move through. At the beginning, standing there with my coffee, watching the street wake up, I thought I had chosen a place where mistakes would be small, correctable, manageable. I thought I'd finally found a version of life where nothing could really go wrong. And because of that belief, I stopped asking the kinds of questions that matter most. The days didn't change shape. That's why I missed it. Morning coffee, the same table, the same walk afterward. Afternoons that stretched without asking much of me. If you'd looked at my life from the outside, you would have said it was steady. Calm. Maybe even boring. But inside that calm, something began leaning on me. It started the way these things always start, with context, not requests. She talked about money the way people talk when they're not asking for help, just explaining reality, rent that didn't line up with ours, a family situation that pulled from every direction at once, small gaps that never quite closed. I listened. That felt like enough at first. Then one day, it wasn't. A bill came up unexpectedly, not dramatic, just poorly timed. I covered it without thinking because it didn't change anything for me. I'd already run the numbers. I had margin. She didn't make a show of gratitude, no tears, no promises, just a quiet thank you and a visible easing of tension. That reaction mattered to me more than I realized. It told me this wasn't manipulation. It told me she wasn't angling. It told me I was choosing to help someone who would have survived without me, just with more difficulty. I like that distinction. The next time something came up, I stepped in again. A ride when transportation fell through, groceries one week when things were tight, always small enough to justify, always framed as temporary. I told myself I was still deciding, and technically, I was. But repetition has weight. Even when you don't call it commitment, the pattern begins to shape expectations. She didn't start asking, she started assuming, not entitlement, habit. If something went wrong, she came to me first. Not because I demanded it, but because I'd made myself the easiest solution in the room. That felt good. That's the part people don't want to admit. Being useful again did something to me. It gave my days contour. It gave me a role without calling it one. After years of being optional back home, being someone's first stop felt grounding. I didn't see how quickly grounding can turn into gravity. Friends back in the States checked in occasionally, asked how Mexico was. I told them it was great, cheap, easy, relaxing. I didn't tell them how often my phone buzzed now. How many small problems found their way to me before they found anyone else. Those problems still felt manageable. That was the trap. At some point, she mentioned paperwork. Nothing alarming. Just the normal friction of living anywhere long enough to need documents handled, forms filed, fees paid. My Spanish was serviceable, but not precise enough for official conversations. She mentioned a family member who helped people with these things, someone who knew how the offices worked, someone she trusted. That last part mattered more to me than the rest. I didn't think of it as handing anything over, just making things smoother, letting someone with local knowledge handle local complexity. It felt responsible. From there, things started routing differently. Translation first, then logistics, then timing. Decisions arrived already framed, not as choices, but as steps in a process already underway. Money began moving in ways that felt administrative instead of personal. Fees, adjustments, deposits. Each one explained clearly enough to quiet doubt. I noticed I asked fewer questions. Not because I didn't care, but because everything had an answer before the question fully formed. That's how comfort works. It removes friction until you forget why friction exists. I still checked my accounts. I still tracked spending. Everything was within the range I'd planned for. I told myself that meant I was still in control. What I didn't see was that control isn't just about numbers. It's about access. I hadn't given anything away all at once. There was no dramatic decision. No single moment that would have sounded an alarm if I replayed it later. Just a series of small deferrals. You handle this. You know the system better. This is faster if we do it that way. It's temporary. Temporary is a dangerous word when it repeats. I remember the first time I felt a pause, a small hesitation before saying yes, a request that came at a bad time. Not unreasonable, just inconvenient. I thought about declining, not permanently, just this once. I didn't. Saying yes was easier than explaining why I couldn't. Easier than watching disappointment cross her face, even briefly. Easier than disrupting the calm we'd built. That's the moment help stops being optional, Not when someone demands it, but when you begin avoiding the discomfort of refusal. The shift was subtle, but it changed the math. Now, when something came up, it wasn't a question of whether I would help. It was a question of how. I didn't call that dependence. I called it closeness. Paperwork increased. So did coordination. More conversations I wasn't present for. More updates delivered secondhand. I trusted them because she trusted them. I trusted her because she hadn't given me a reason not to. That kind of trust feels earned, even when it isn't tested. There was one decision. I can see it clearly now. That should have slowed me down. It felt like an efficiency move at the time. A way to simplify access. To reduce friction for future problems. I remember thinking, this will make things safer. That thought still unsettles me, because safety isn't about how easy things become. It's about whether you can stop them when you need to. After that, I slept well. That's another thing that kept me from noticing. Anxiety didn't arrive. Fear didn't spike. My body didn't react. I felt closer than ever. Not romantically, but structurally. Like we were finally operating inside the same system. I didn't realize that system no longer centered on me. I still believed I could leave anytime. That nothing bound me. That I wasn't trapped. And again, technically, that was true. But choice, once filtered through habit, convenience, and the desire to maintain calm, starts to look a lot like momentum. Momentum doesn't announce where it's taking you. It just keeps moving. I told myself I was doing things differently than the men I'd heard about. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't rushing. I was patient, measured, reasonable. What I didn't understand yet was that patience, when paired with delegation, can quietly hollow out authority. By the end of that stretch, months, not years, I felt deeply involved without ever feeling like I'd agreed to anything binding. That contradiction didn't trouble me then. It felt like proof that I'd found a balance most people never do. Connection without obligation. Help without sacrifice. Looking back, I can see how fragile that balance was, how much it depended on me not asking the wrong question at the wrong time. Because the moment you ask the wrong question, you find out whether you're part of the structure or just supporting it. I hadn't asked yet. I still believed everything was flexible, that nothing was locked in, that if something didn't feel right later, I could simply adjust. That belief made everything that followed feel reasonable, even when reason was no longer on my side. The man who finally made me uneasy didn't show up like trouble. He showed up like the person you call when you need something done. She mentioned him the way you mention a tool you've used before. A cousin, or an uncle, or a friend of the family. The exact relationship didn't matter as much as the tone she used when she said his name. Familiar. Trusting. Like his presence meant the problem was already solved. I remember feeling relieved. That should have been a warning, but relief is deceptive. It tells you the hard part is over, when really you just handed the hard part to someone else. He was friendly in a practiced way. Not warm, not cold. Efficient. He spoke quickly, and when I looked confused, he slowed down just enough to make me feel included. He knew which office handled what. He knew which person behind the desk mattered. He knew how to phrase things so the answer came back clean and final. Most of all, he knew the language. Not just Spanish, but the language of process. And because he helped, I started treating him as part of the background, like a utility. Someone you don't think about until the water stops running. At first, it was simple stuff. A form, an appointment, a fee that had to be paid in cash on a day when I couldn't make it. He offered to handle it. She vouched for him. I said yes. It didn't feel like trust. It felt like convenience. Then it became a pattern. He began to be included in conversations that used to happen between me and her. Not because anyone announced it, but because it was easier. He translated. He summarized. He handled things. The strange thing is, I didn't feel pushed out. I felt helped. There's a big difference between those two feelings, and I think that's why I let it continue. When money moved through him, it was always for practical reasons. A deposit, a payment, an urgent requirement that couldn't wait. Each explanation made sense on its own, especially because I didn't know enough to challenge the logic. Every system has its own rhythm, Mexico included. I knew that. I didn't want to be the guy who treated his unfamiliarity like a lawsuit. I wanted to adapt. I wanted to accept that I was in someone else's country, inside someone else's way of doing things. So when something felt slightly off, I told myself it was my perspective. This is the part that's hard to say out loud, but it's true. I was proud of how patient I was being. Patience became proof that I wasn't one of those men. The ones who show up loud and entitled, then complain that nothing works the way it works back home. I didn't want to be that, so I waited. I nodded. I let things happen. The first inconsistency I noticed wasn't a big one. It was a number that didn't match what I remembered, a timeline that shifted by a week, then two, a detail that was explained one way on Monday and another way on Friday. When I asked, he had answers. Always. Sometimes his answers were good, sometimes they were vague, but the tone was steady. Reasonable, like I was asking about weather. And steady answers are persuasive even when they're incomplete. A few months into this, I asked to see a document I assumed already included me. Not because I suspected anything, because I wanted to feel oriented. I wanted to understand what was happening with my own life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked casually, like a person checking the mail. He told me it wasn't finalized yet. That sentence landed softly, but it had weight. Not finalized yet. Okay, fine, normal. But then not finalized yet became the default explanation for everything I asked to see. Copies would come later. Signatures were pending. The office was slow. The person in charge wasn't available. Always later. And later has a way of becoming permanent when you stop insisting on now. The thing about structure is that you don't notice it until you try to move inside it and discover you can't. That happened to me at a bank. It was a simple issue. I needed information about an account. I expected a small conversation. Instead, I was met with polite confusion and then polite refusal. The teller looked at my passport, looked back at the screen, and explained, calmly, professionally, that I wasn't authorized to ask what I was asking. I remember the exact sensation of that moment. My face stayed neutral, but inside I felt heat, then cold. It was the feeling of being excluded from something you assumed you were part of. I walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to understand what I just learned. It wasn't that money was gone. It was that access wasn't mine. That's what people misunderstand about these stories. It's not always theft, it's often architecture. A structure built just slightly off center, so that when you finally lean on it, you realize you're not in the frame. I brought it up that evening. Carefully. Calmly. I didn't say, "What did you do?" I said, "I'm confused. I thought I was on this." The response wasn't anger. It wasn't panic. It was reassurance. Explanations came smoothly. There were reasons for it, steps to fix it, paperwork still in progress, nothing to worry about yet. He spoke. She nodded. I listened. And the most dangerous part was that I wanted to believe it. I wanted it to be a misunderstanding, because the alternative meant I had been careless. So I accepted reassurance. The next day, I asked again, not aggressively, just firmly. I asked to see copies. I asked to be present for the next appointment. I asked for clarity in a way I hadn't asked before. The answers didn't refuse. They deflected. He said it was complicated. He said it would confuse me. He said the office would take longer if I was there. He said he was handling it. He was always handling it. That phrase started to irritate me, not because it was rude, but because it had an edge I hadn't noticed before. The implication that my involvement was a problem. That's when I understood control had shifted while I was being patient. It didn't feel like betrayal yet. It felt like a door closing quietly. Not slammed, just shut. I started paying attention in a new way. I watched who spoke when decisions were being discussed. I watched who held the papers. I watched for my questions when to die. My questions didn't start fights. They started silence. That's what changed the temperature. She became more distant, not hostile, tired. Conversations shortened. Plans were less specific. When I tried to talk about structure, she spoke about feelings. When I tried to talk about access, she spoke about trust. And I could feel the trap in that, even if no one intended it. Because if you push too hard, you become the bad guy, the suspicious foreigner, the man who doesn't trust, the man who changed. I didn't want to be that. I'd spent my whole life being the steady one. But steadiness can become passivity if you're not careful. I tried one more time to bring everything into the open. I asked for a meeting where we'd all sit down and go through the details. Slowly, clearly, no rushing, no summaries. He agreed with the same steady voice he always used. The meeting never happened. Something always came up. Someone was busy. Something had to be done first. It was always later. And that's when it finally hit me in a clean, undeniable way. The mistake wasn't that I trusted someone emotionally. The mistake was that I let comfort become a substitute for verification. I handed over the skeleton of my life because nothing had gone wrong yet, and because I didn't want to disrupt the calm that had become my reason for being there. Once you do that, you can't get control back by asking politely. You can only get it back by breaking the structure. And by then, the structure has other people inside it holding it up. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and stared at my accounts the way you stare at a medical result you don't want to interpret. Everything looked normal at first glance. Numbers, transfers, a clean surface. But the surface wasn't the point anymore. The point was simple, and it scared me in a quiet, adult way. I didn't know what I actually owned. I didn't know what I could actually access. And I didn't know who would answer if I needed the truth. If you were waiting for a blow-up, this is where you'd be disappointed. There was no fight, no shouting, no moment where someone finally admitted what had happened. What came instead was quiet. A kind of administrative silence that spread slowly, like fog, until you realize you can't see where you are anymore. After that meeting never materialized, I stopped pretending things were fine. I didn't confront anyone dramatically. I didn't accuse. I just started asking clearer questions. Not emotional questions, structural ones. What exactly is in my name? What accounts do I have access to? What happens if I need to move money tomorrow? Those questions didn't get angry responses. They didn't get refusals either. They got softened, rounded off, rephrased into something easier to answer. That's when I understood something important. When a system no longer needs you, it doesn't attack you, it waits you out. She became distant in a way that was hard to call withdrawal. She still answered messages, still checked in, but the tone was different, shorter, less curious. Conversation stayed on the surface. Anytime I tried to talk about details, paperwork, money, next steps, she redirected to how stressed she felt, how tired everyone was, how much pressure there was on all sides, and I felt it, the invisible line forming. If I pushed, I wasn't asking questions anymore. I was creating problems. I hated that feeling. I'd spent my whole life being the person who didn't create problems. The third party stopped answering calls altogether. Messages went unread. When replies came, they were vague and final. Busy right now. We'll talk later. This takes time. Time became the enemy. I started going directly to offices myself. Banks, municipal buildings, anywhere I thought I could get a straight answer. What I got instead was clarity without sympathy, foreign ownership rules explained patiently, contracts reviewed without drama, signatures pointed out, including where mine were missing. No one told me I'd been cheated. They didn't need to. They explained the situation the way you explain weather to someone who forgot to check the forecast. This is how it works. This is what applies. This is what can be changed. My money wasn't gone in the way people imagine loss. It still existed. It just wasn't reachable in the way I'd assumed it would be. Tied up, committed, dependent on cooperation that was no longer guaranteed. I kept waiting for anger to show up. It didn't. Anger requires a villain. What I was facing was architecture, rules, processes, social expectations that didn't bend because I felt misled. What arrived instead was shame. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that sits behind your eyes when you realize you can't explain what happened without sounding irresponsible. I stopped telling people back home how things were going. Every version of the story felt incomplete. Or worse, like an excuse. The cafe routine continued for a while. Same table, same coffee, same street. But now it felt like I was watching my life instead of living it. That's when I noticed how little was actually anchored to me. The apartment lease would end soon. The accounts weren't fully mine. The plans we discussed existed only in conversation. I started doing math again. Not the optimistic kind. The kind you do when you're preparing for loss. How long could I stay if nothing improved? What would it take to leave? What did starting over look like at my age? Those were not questions I'd planned to revisit. The relationship didn't end. It thinned. She didn't accuse me. She didn't disappear overnight. She simply stepped back, emotionally first, practically second. The warmth that had once filled space between us evaporated without a fight. I could feel it happening and still not stop it. Because stopping it would have required something I didn't have anymore: leverage. At some point, there's no clean date. I understood that the version of retirement I'd imagined was no longer available. Not in Mexico. Not with the resources I could still reach. That realization didn't feel like panic. It felt like compression. Like the future narrowing into something smaller, harder, less forgiving. I told myself I'd return to the US temporarily, just to regroup, just to stabilize. That word came back again, stabilize. Packing was harder than I expected. Not because of emotion, but because of intention. Every item I touched carried the weight of a plan I'd assumed would unfold naturally. I didn't hate Mexico. I didn't blame it. The systems had done exactly what systems do, rewarded those who understood them and ignored those who didn't. I didn't hate her either. That confused me at first. I could see the pressure she lived under. Family expectations that didn't pause, economic realities that didn't leave room for hesitation, a structure where proximity to money wasn't greed, it was survival. None of that made what happened okay, but it made it comprehensible. I realized then that I hadn't lost love first. I'd lost stability. Love had always been secondary in this story, something that could fade without collapsing the whole structure. Stability was the load-bearing wall, and I'd handed it over without inspecting the frame. When I finally left the apartment for the last time, there was no dramatic goodbye, just keys placed on a counter, a door closing behind me with the same sound it had always made. The city didn't react. It didn't need to. Nothing had exploded. Nothing had been stolen loudly. Everything had just shifted out of reach while I was being patient. That's what collapse looks like when it doesn't announce itself. Not fire, not noise, just absence. Notice too late to reverse. Coming back to the United States felt like stepping into a room where the lights were too bright. Everything was louder than I remembered. Conversations moved faster. People asked questions they expected answered immediately. I stayed with my brother at first, sleeping in a small room that still smelled like fresh paint and cardboard boxes. He didn't press me for details. He just handed me a key and told me to take whatever time I needed. That was harder than interrogation would have been. I told people I was back temporarily, that I needed to reset a few things, that Mexico had been good, but complicated. All of that was true in the way half-truths usually are. What I didn't say was that the version of myself who'd left had not come back. I found work within a month, nothing impressive. Early mornings, long hours on my feet, the kind of job where no one asks about your past because they're too focused on getting through their own day. My body complained more than it used to. Knees stiff in the morning, lower back that never quite loosened up. Still, there was relief in earning again. Money you earn feels different than money you plan to live on. It has weight. It reminds you that survival isn't theoretical. At night, I lay awake replaying decisions. Not arguments, not conversations where someone said something cruel. I replayed the moments that felt reasonable at the time. The first time I said yes without asking follow-up questions. The first document I didn't insist on seeing. The first time I told myself I was being patient, when really I was being avoidant. I didn't think about her as much as I expected to. That surprised me. When I did, it wasn't with anger. It was with understanding that came too late to be useful. She wasn't a villain in the way stories like this want villains. She didn't wake up one morning planning to dismantle my life. She lived inside a set of pressures that rewarded proximity to resources and punished hesitation. Family expectations that didn't soften just because someone felt uncomfortable. A system where relationships were not separate from survival. She made choices that made sense where she stood. So did I. The difference was that I'd mistaken calm for safety and kindness for structure. I thought back to those mornings in Mexico, the cafe, the street vendors setting up, the feeling that my days were finally manageable. That memory still felt clean, undamaged. Mexico itself wasn't the problem. That clarity mattered to me because bitterness would have been easier. Bitterness gives you something to push against. It lets you offload responsibility. What I was left with instead was ownership. I had given trust a skeleton before it had earned one. I had handed over access because nothing had gone wrong yet. I'd assumed that good intentions could substitute for verification. Loneliness wasn't what drove me. That's too simple. Loneliness is loud. It announces itself. What drove me was something quieter, the desire to be useful again without being needed too much, to belong without obligation, to feel anchored without being responsible. That desire made me generous in the wrong places and careful in the wrong ways. I didn't regret going to Mexico. I still don't. I regret the assumptions I carried with me. Assumptions shaped by a life where systems work predictably, as long as you followed the rules, where trust and structure usually overlapped, where access was rarely questioned once granted. I hadn't understood how quickly those assumptions dissolve when you step into systems that don't share your defaults. People asked if I'd warn others. If I'd tell them not to do what I did, I never knew how to answer that cleanly. Warnings don't work when people think they're smarter than the story they're hearing. I certainly did. If I say anything now, it's quieter than advice. I say, pay attention to structure before you pay attention to feelings. Feelings can come early. Connection can come early. Help can come early. Structure should come last. If you don't know exactly where your name is, on paper, in accounts, in decisions, then you don't know where you stand, no matter how calm things feel. I didn't lose everything in one moment. I lost it by letting comfort replace curiosity. By choosing ease over clarity again and again because nothing seemed urgent enough to challenge. Fear didn't undo me. Comfort did. Back in the US, life settled into a smaller shape. Not worse, just narrower. Fewer options, less margin. The future became something I managed week by week instead of imagining years ahead. That adjustment hurt more than the loss itself, because what I'd really lost wasn't money. It was the belief that I'd finally stepped into a phase of life where mistakes would be small and recoverable. I learned that there's no such phase. There's only attention, or the lack of it. Sometimes, when I wake up early and the house is quiet, I think about that version of myself sitting at the cafe window, convinced he'd found a place where nothing could really go wrong. I don't judge him. He was tired. He was careful in the ways he knew how to be careful. He just didn't know which questions mattered yet. That's the part no one tells you. That maturity doesn't protect you from loss. It just changes the shape of it. What I carry forward now isn't a warning about Mexico or about relationships or about starting over later in life. It's a simpler understanding. Trust isn't something you feel. It's something you can verify. And calm is not proof that you're safe. It's often just proof that you've stopped checking. If there's anything like peace left in this story, it's that clarity. Not loud, not dramatic, just solid. The kind you earn after everything that could have distracted you from it has already fallen away.